Thank you all for joining us today for a conversation about U.S. policy as it pertains to the Israel-Gaza crisis. We're honored to welcome to MIT our speakers, Dennis Ross and Melanie Kamet. My name is Evan Lieberman, and I direct the Center for International Studies, and I'm a professor of political science here at MIT. CIS is co-sponsoring today's event with the Middle East and North Africa MIT Initiative, abbreviated as MENA MIT, and with another acronym organization, MIT ICEO, the Institute Community and Equity Office. Our goal in hosting this event today is to encourage productive and civil dialogue on a very difficult, sensitive, and contentious topic. Of course, we don't expect that what is said today will be to everyone's satisfaction. This region has been long a source of conflict and violence. Peace plans have been incredibly elusive, and the current moment is a particularly challenging one. There are many views about what U.S. policy should be and about the future of the conflict itself. Today's event is intended to offer some additional perspectives from extremely informed experts. So this is a forum, it's a public event that we've advertised as an opportunity for all of you to attend and to hear from our guest speakers, and we've set aside time to hear from you as well during the Q&A session, which is going to be which is on an online platform. So this allows us a bit more time to address as many questions as possible, and we ask that you please respect the format of the event. So we're going to ask you to please submit your question at any time, starting now online. The QR code is up there, and it's also on your ticket, and we'll take you to the online platform. And at the moment, while you're thinking about your phones, I'd appreciate it if you would silence them. We'll also be hosting a reception in Lobby 13 immediately following the event, and this will be a time when you can engage with our speakers. And again, we'll ask that you use that time as productively as possible. I'd like to thank Phil Khoury, the Vice Provost of MIT and a Ford International Professor of History, who's going to serve as our moderator today. Professor Khoury is a political and social historian of the Middle East. He joined the MIT History faculty in 1981, and he served as the SHAS, which is our School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences Dean, between 1991 and 2006, and became Vice Provost in 2006. At CIS, he established the Emil Bustani Middle East Seminar, a public forum that has been examining contemporary Middle East issues since 1985. I'd also like to thank Karl Reid, MIT's first Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, for providing closing remarks today. After earning 2 MIT degrees in material science and engineering, Dr. Reid spent a dozen years in the computing industry. In 1998, he returned to MIT to direct the MITES program and then the Office of Minority Education. He went on to leadership roles at 2 national organizations, the United Negro College Fund and the National Society of Black Engineers. And then last March, we welcomed him back to MIT. Karl has a doctorate in education from Harvard, and he received an honorary doctorate in engineering from the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. Dennis Ross is the counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. And for more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process as the U.S. point person on in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He also served as special assistant to President Obama and as National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region and as special advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Melanie Kamet is the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs, and she directs the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. She also holds a secondary faculty appointment at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Kamet's award-winning books include Compassionate Communalism, Welfare and Sectarianism in Lebanon, and A Political Economy of the Middle East. Her current research projects explore toleration and reconciliation after ethno-religious violence, and on topics of development and identity politics. She's published numerous articles in academic and policy journals, and she serves as commissioner on the Lancet Commission on Syria. So the format is as follows. Our speakers will each have 20 minutes from the podium. Dennis Ross will speak first, and when he concludes, Melanie Cammett will come speak. And after she delivers her remarks, our two speakers can join Phil Khoury on stage to begin a discussion and then to take questions from the audience. Again, we'll ask you to enter your questions online with a QR code on the ticket. But now, please join me in welcoming Dennis Ross to the platform.
So I have to, can you hear me if I walk like this? Okay. Since when I teach, I always walk and talk. So the reason is more things occur to me when I'm walking and talking than if I'm standing simply behind the podium. So I'm going to walk and I'm going to talk. All right, so you see what the title of this lecture is. And I want to start by saying I was actually a political appointee for 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents. And people often ask me, how did you manage that? And I said, well, I've been dealing with Arabs and Israelis, so how hard could it be? I will say it turned out to be harder than I thought, but given what's going on right now, obviously I could talk about Lebanon. I have no idea, I have plenty of ideas, but I'm sure we're going to end up with questions about that. I'd rather focus on the title of the talk, which is really Gaza, what's going on, and sort of US policy choices. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Hamas, who they are, talk about what happened effectively on October 7th, talk about the Israeli response to it, and talk about what the US has tried to do, which, as I will point out, was morally, I think, right, at least in terms of trying to resolve this, was also a logical approach, but was probably not going to succeed, and I'll suggest another way of having gone about it. Let me start with Hamas, and I'm going to start by telling a story. The beginning of 2005, I was invited to Gaza City to give a talk to what was then the Gaza Council on Foreign Relations. And I spoke to a group that was probably actually a little bit larger than this one. And this was after Prime Minister Sharon had announced that Israel would be withdrawing from Gaza, but they had not yet withdrawn from Gaza. So I said to this group that, look, you now have an opportunity. In the past, one thing's been clear. Palestinians have never been in a position where they could control their own destiny. They could determine it. I said, but Israel's getting out of Gaza. And if you turn Gaza into a going concern, then the rest of the world and even the Israelis will say, if it's good enough for Gaza, then why not the West Bank? But if you choose to turn Gaza into a platform for attacks against Israel, who's going to say, let's take that failed model and apply it elsewhere? Now we know Hamas, let's say, even though I will tell you, when I was speaking there, the whole leadership of Hamas was there. And one of the founders, Mahmoud Zahar, was the first person I saw. Well, they obviously didn't take my advice. And their approach was to continue resistance, as they describe resistance. Even before the Israelis withdrew, and as they were withdrawing, they were carrying out attacks. In the first 6 months after Israel withdrew from Gaza, they were attacking the crossing points. There were 6 crossing points from Israel into Gaza. The crossing points weren't of favor to the Israelis. The crossing points were where everything could go into and out of Gaza. They attacked the crossing points, so the Israelis reduced the number of crossing points in the first 6 months from 6 to 2 because of the attacks. Eventually in 2007, we know that they carried out a coup against the Palestinian Authority and against Fatah. They did it in a way that was particularly brutal, throwing many of the Fatah people off the tops of buildings. And this was in June of 2007. Now, between September 2005 and June of 2007, when the Israelis, after the Israelis had withdrawn, but before Hamas carried out the coup, there was no Israeli embargo or quarantine of Gaza. So for 20 months, there was no quarantine of Gaza. The reality is the Israelis imposed a quarantine after that. And it is fair for people to say that when the Israelis did that over time, they did turn Gaza into an open-air prison for the Palestinians who lived there. But they did not create an open-air prison for Hamas, because Hamas got whatever they wanted. They built 300 miles of tunnels using enormous amounts of cement, wiring, metal, piping, everything that could have been useful above ground, they built below ground. These tunnels that they built obviously would have been something highly useful for the surface. Those tunnels, when this war began after October 7th, those tunnels were not available to Palestinians to come and, in a sense, gain some shelter from the bombing. I can tell you throughout the 1990s, when I was the American negotiator, every single time that we were making progress, without exception, we would get a Hamas bomb. We didn't get the Hamas bombs because they wanted us to succeed in terms of peace. We didn't get the Hamas bombs because they wanted a two-state outcome. Their view was and has been no Israel. That is who Hamas is, and what we saw on October 7th was a manifestation again of who and what Hamas is. So you have on October 7th a horrific reality. You have on October 7th Hamas carrying out a surprise and shocking attack. We've seen extraordinary Israeli intelligence as it relates to Lebanon today. What we've seen is they had very little intelligence as it related to Hamas. In the Q&A, if you want, we can get into why that was the case. The fact is they created a great shock on the Israeli side. The nature of the way they carried out these attacks, the scale of the atrocities, killing children before they're in front of their parents, parents in front of children, going to the Nova Festival. These were mostly young Israelis enjoying what was a music festival, slaughtering them, the sexual violence. All of this, ironically, was kind of a shock to the Israelis. They were used to Hamas terror, but the scale of this, the sheer humanity of it, creates a shock also because the Israelis themselves are surprised. A, it's a huge strategic intelligence failure, but also the Israeli military is completely unprepared for it. One of the things to this day, in Israel today, it's still October 7th. And it's still October 7th because there are still hostages. It's still October 7th because there's been no real explanation for the character of the, not so much the surprise, but in a sense, you know, why was the military so unable for close to 8 hours to do very much? And there's still October 7th because there's been no accountability. No accountability for the worst day in Israel's history. No accountability for the military or for the political leadership. I do believe we will see political reckoning at some point within Israel. I mention this as part of the backdrop because when the Israelis begin their response in Gaza, they have no plan. There's no plan on the shelf that they pull off the shelf and they say, okay, here's how we're going to deal militarily with this. No, they have no plan. And for the first couple of weeks, before they go in on the ground, they're bombing in a way that we haven't seen before. Now, partly they're bombing that way, partly because they have no plan. Partly they're bombing that way because before, recall, 2009, 2012, 2019, 2021, you had previous such mini wars. In one case, in 2014, it's not a mini war. It goes on for 51 days. But in all those times, their aim wasn't to basically remove Hamas from power. So there are all sorts of targets, especially targets where Hamas might be, but the civilian casualties were going to be too high that they wouldn't touch. When this bombing starts, there are no limits. It isn't to say after the first couple of weeks they're not giving warnings to people to evacuate, but it is to say they are carrying out a military campaign in a way that isn't anything that, like they've done before Because now the focus, partly it's the shock, partly it's the anger, partly it's the absence of a plan, and partly it's the idea, okay, we have to be able to remove Hamas from power in Gaza. We can't live with Hamas next door because it's pretty clear, if given the chance, they'll do this again. So the nature of the military campaign is one that takes on a kind of life of its own, and it's a military campaign where even if there's warnings given to Palestinians to move or to evacuate, it's clear the priority is not trying to limit the number of casualties on the civilian side, in part because you also have something else. There is a cruel dilemma here for the Israelis. Hamas has a strategy where they have embedded themselves in highly dense populated areas, and they are using the population as a human shield. In many ways, the Hamas approach to their population in Gaza has been everybody should be prepared to be a martyr. Only they didn't ask the Palestinians in Gaza whether or not they wanted to be martyrs. So Hamas creates that reality. The Israeli response is one that almost by definition is going to end up producing what is really a horrific toll. And the Israelis also, when it comes to the issue of humanitarian assistance is initially not provided, and it takes a lot of American pressure to get the Israelis to go ahead and provide it. Why is that the case? Why wasn't there at least a sense that they would allow humanitarian assistance to go in? Here again, you're dealing with what is anger in the Israeli public. The images of the hostages are there. Recall, you have hostages taken as young as 9 months old and as old as 85. And the Israeli body politic is looking at this and saying, why should we be providing humanitarian assistance when they're holding our hostages? The Red Cross has no access to them. There's no distinction drawn in the Israeli body politic between Hamas and the population there. I wrote an article actually 2 weeks after the beginning of the war in which I said, look, in all previous circumstances, I would have been the first to say there has to be a ceasefire. But not this time, because Hamas cannot come out of this looking like what they did was successful, because that will provide huge impetus for their ideology of rejection and resistance. But I also wrote, it is incumbent on Israel to make it demonstrate unmistakably they're going after Hamas, they're not going after the Palestinian public. Israel must be responsible for getting humanitarian assistance in and making sure it gets distributed. This was a huge mistake, in my mind, on the Israeli side, because by doing it, they increasingly delegitimized what they were doing. The Israelis sort of lament the fact that what is a defensive war from their standpoint, and which was imposed on them, is one that has very little legitimacy internationally. Precisely because of the way the Israelis approached the issue of humanitarian assistance, they contributed to that problem. Okay, so how did the Biden administration approach this? Initially, the way the Biden administration approached it was to support the Israelis. You had President Biden going to Israel, the first American president ever to go to Israel during wartime, to in a sense embrace Israel, to support Israel, to provide huge amounts of military assistance to Israel. All of this reflected an understanding that the shock and the appalling nature of what happened on October 7th required the U.S. to be there for Israel. This reflected a judgment on the part of Biden, but also an emotional attachment, or reflects the emotional attachment that he feels to the state. And what he saw, he described it. This was a case of sheer evil that was carried out on October 7th. The U.S. did succeed over time in terms of getting Israel to provide humanitarian assistance. And even now, the issue is not the lack of humanitarian assistance going in. The issue is there's no security for it once it goes in, because Gaza is lawless. Hamas diverts this, criminal gangs divert this. There are trucks that go in, and they're not allowed to go in unless they do payoffs. There hasn't been an approach to providing security on the ground for this. But the American approach was sort of twofold. One, try to do as much as you can to make sure Israel provided humanitarian assistance. Two, come up with an approach to get the hostages released. 109 hostages were released on a deal in November. There has not been a deal since. The logic, the approach of the administration was to say, okay, if we can get a hostage deal, the hostage deal will create a pause. It'll lead to a ceasefire. A framework was created, which actually was agreed going back to February, of 3 phases, 42 days at a time. You would have a pause. The administration's view of this was, we will create a pause. The pause will allow us to fix the humanitarian situation. We will create a structural response to the humanitarian situation during the pause. The pause will go on long enough that it will allow us to take, A will turn into a ceasefire. We will negotiate a permanent ceasefire in the 2nd phase. And that combination will allow us to finalize what is a Saudi deal of normalization with Israel. The Saudis want it because they want a defense treaty with the United States. We can get into why they want that. They understood to get a defense treaty with the United States so it could pass the US Senate, which requires 67 votes, they would have to normalize with Israel. That was the price that they would pay, normalization with Israel. But they sought from us, and they sought us to deliver this, a Palestinian dimension of this. Initially, they talked about a time-bound, irreversible process for a Palestinian state. Then they accepted what I would describe as a little bit more vague formula, which is a credible pathway to a state. All this perfectly logical. All this makes sense. The only problem with the approach was it made Yahya Sinwar, now the head of Hamas, it made Yahya Sinwar the arbiter of whether or not you could have such a deal. Now that assumes that Bibi Netanyahu was prepared to do a hostage deal, which many Israelis actually question. Okay, I got 5 minutes, and so I'm going to explain everything else in 5 minutes. I understand there is a trapdoor here, so I really take the 5 minutes seriously. The problem, as I said, was if Sinwar, even assuming Bibi was prepared to do the hostage deal, Sinwar was the arbiter of it. Sinwar, from October 7th, hoped to ignite what was going to be an all-out Hezbollah war, 150,000 rockets from Hezbollah to Israel, an explosion in the West Bank, Israeli Arabs rising up, and the other Shia militias, the other Shia proxies, going to war. It hadn't happened, but now you look at what's going on in Lebanon and with Israel, you think that Sinwar now thinks this is a good time to do a deal? Hardly. So that approach, though logical, depended upon Yahya Sinwar wanting to have such a deal. I understood the approach. I always felt there was an alternative approach. What I just described was an approach that basically said a hostage deal leads to the end of the war. There's another way to think about it. How about ending the war to lead to the release of hostages? And here I would say, while that might seem obvious at one level, but maybe not so clear-cut at another, one of the ways to think about this was, if you define what the Israelis say they needed, what Bibi Netanyahu said he needed to show that he dismantled Hamas as a military, and he needed to know that Hamas was not going to be in control of Gaza. Look at where we are today. Hamas no longer has a military. They had 5 brigades and 24 battalions. They're gone. Yes, they probably still have 5,000 to 10,000 people with weapons, but they're not organized as a military. Secondly, they had a huge military infrastructure, weapons depots, weapon production labs, weapons labs. The reality is they have the tunnels. Now, the Israelis have probably destroyed 50% of the tunnels. I would say probably 70 to 75% of the actual military infrastructure. So this is a point, and it has been a point for some time, where the US could go to him and say, okay, let's define an outcome to the war. Let's define success. You've said Hamas can't have a military and they can't be in control of Gaza. Well, you pretty much have ended them as a military, so the key is they can't reconstitute themselves. We can assume, we can work with the Egyptians, and we can guarantee we can shut off the smuggling into Gaza. We can make sure Hamas doesn't get any more money by organizing others. We can manage, we can organize a mechanism to ensure that reconstruction, which will be massive, has mechanisms to ensure there can't be diversions of material. Now, you need something beyond that. Hamas can't reconstitute itself. Someone else has to be in control of Gaza. You cannot leave a vacuum in Gaza, because the vacuum in Gaza will be filled by either Hamas, other extremists, or you will create Somalia next door, which you don't want. So the answer here is some kind of interim administration. The interim administration can be international. We already know the UAE has said that it's prepared to play a major role. It's prepared to be part of a stabilization force. The UAE, Egypt, maybe Morocco can play this role. You can have an interim administration with Arabs. You'll have to use Palestinians on the ground. There's at least 50,000 Palestinians who do the day-to-day functional responsibilities. I'll take 2 more minutes, I'll be done. I just anticipated that. So you have the Palestinians there. There will have to be a connection to the Palestinian Authority. The UAE and the Egyptians are not coming in unless there's a Palestinian request to them to come in. They're not coming in to rescue the Israelis so they'll leave. They're coming in to respond to Palestinian needs. Bibi Netanyahu has said that Israel doesn't want to stay in Gaza. You will not produce this kind of an international mechanism unless, in fact, Israel is prepared to withdraw from Gaza. It is not in Israel's interest to stay in Gaza. It is not in Israel's interest to have wars of attrition on all of its fronts, and I'll close with this. Now, I have a new book that is coming out in February. I have a long chapter on the Iranians. The Iranians developed a strategy towards Israel. Iran, for a long period of time under the Supreme Leader, has made it explicitly clear they have an objective to see the end of Israel. They are more optimistic they will see the end of Israel sooner rather than later. Their strategy was sort of articulated by Qasem Soleimani, the former head of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guard. He said, build a ring of fire around Israel. The logic was bog Israel down in wars on every front, and the Israelis themselves, you'll see, they'll leave. That'll be the end of Israel. Well, the Israelis, if they don't want to play into the hands of the Supreme Leader, they should have an interest in not being bogged down in wars of attrition on every front. I'm hoping right now that what the administration may be doing with Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to find out, what are you hoping to achieve right now in Lebanon? At a certain level, you want to get Hezbollah to decouple from Gaza. The problem is, where is what you're doing going to end? If you don't want to have wars of attrition on every front, let's figure out a way to allow populations in southern Lebanon, which probably 200,000 now have left the south. 60,000 Israelis haven't been able to go back to the north. Why don't we start with a pause, and a pause in which populations on both sides are allowed to return? My sense is that Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah may himself decide that it's not in his interest to see this war go much farther. If he really had an interest in having it go much farther, you would see attacks against Tel Aviv. We haven't seen that yet. I will stop there.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I'll just make some remarks, and let me say I'm pleased to be here, and also want to offer my condolences to everyone suffering in the region, Palestinians, Israelis, now Lebanese. It's been a really horrible last year, and it is ongoing. So it's hopefully solutions will come, and this will come to a close soon. So let me just say that I'm coming at this from the position of someone who studies the Middle East and also who studies post-conflict reconciliation, which seems extremely far at the moment. And I'm working on a book on how people live together after violence in Bosnia, in Lebanon, in Northern Ireland. But that's after violence. That's decades after, and right now we're in violence, so I think we're in a very different game here. I will say that I've literally just come from Belfast, where colleagues were saying to me that in the 90s, Israelis and Palestinians in the Oslo era were coming to Belfast saying, you know, things are looking good, there's hope for you. And then several years later, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and eventually there was peace in Northern Ireland, and now the tables have turned, and peace looks extremely far from Israel-Palestine, and the Good Friday Agreement has held for decades. So the tables have turned. So I just want to make a few points about the larger context and also some sort of micro level context here about how violence and conflict makes it harder to move past and to be able to reach resolution. So, and let me start by saying that I would argue that there is no military solution. Even if you've degraded Hamas's capabilities tremendously, and that's absolutely true, this is not going to be solved through a military solution, and that this is just breeding more folks that are ready to be recruited for radical movements. So ultimately, this is going to have to be a negotiated solution. And that's the only way that this is going to get solved, and a solution that comes up with justice and rights and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. And so we need to, I think, start with the assumption that all lives are equally important and that nobody's going anywhere. 7 million Israelis and 7 million Palestinians between the river and the sea are not going anywhere. So something has got to be shifted here. So we've seen that there have been multiple wars since ~48, and it feels like we're farther from a solution than ever. Repeated rounds of violence and attacks, and Hamas is badly degraded, but not totally eliminated, and can reconstitute itself and pose a threat in the future. And so nothing is going to be solved until we have attention to the root causes of this conflict, that there are two peoples with claims to the same territories, and without addressing the security and territorial needs of both peoples, it's not going to end. And we know from large amounts of social science research on ethnic politics and conflict that the most surefire way to solve problems is by addressing the needs for security, for rights, for that political inclusion and economic inclusion and so forth is the way to get there. So somehow this is going to have to happen for both Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I just want to make a sort of quick dive into micro-level social psychology. And we're in a terrible moment where so much violence has occurred, and Israelis are shocked and suffering, as Ambassador Ross has mentioned, from the horrible experiences they went through on October 7th. And now we have a Palestinian population that's traumatized and devastated. And under these conditions of deep, deep, real and perceived threat perceptions, it's really difficult for people to look at each other as human beings. You get into a cycle of dehumanization and the tendency to view entire groups as homogeneous, to sort of ascribe to the Palestinians one set of political preferences, for example, that is encapsulated by Hamas, even though we know that Hamas was not very popular on the eve of October 7th and had something like 30% support. It's very difficult to get out of these cycles of dehumanization, and this matters. And it works the other way as well, of course. This matters tremendously because until people can recognize each other as human beings, it's very difficult to engage in any kind of dialogue. This applies both at the micro level, people-to-people exchanges, but also with political leaders and political elites. And you have a situation where, for example, on the Israeli side, the population is so traumatized that it is not, that there's pressure on the administration, and there hasn't been a serious block on the Israeli government to go in and engage in large-scale military response. And so this makes it incredibly difficult to get out of this cycle. And so the question is, how can you get political leaders to rise above this and start to move into a direction of reaching some kind of set of negotiations that will unravel this thing. Ironically, I've just come from a conference in Belfast that was all about, it was called Leaders Making Peace, about the incentives to leaders to try to take courageous actions and rise above the situations that they're in and take steps towards peace is probably too strong a word. Reconciliation is too strong a word right now. That can come later. But some kind of set of steps to wind this down and reach a more sustainable situation. So this is going to take pressure. And it is very much in the interests of political leaders at times like these not to compromise, because again, their bases are traumatized and are out there looking for revenge, and so they don't have that kind of bottom-up pressure so much. And it's also difficult because we have an international context that has not been really exerting pressure to try to bring this to an end. So we have an international system that's really blocked up, where the UN is not able to speak with one voice. The United States has a long history of an alliance with Israel and is not exerting pressure on the Netanyahu government to change its policies. And so I think it's an extremely difficult situation, but it's not going to move until there are pressures on leaders to make these courageous actions. So let me just say a few things about the longer term scenarios. And we've got a number of solutions out there. I don't think the problem is lack of solutions. There's been solutions out there for decades that have been negotiated, but clearly they have not been able to be achieved. And there's a number of things that are out there. There, of course, is the two-state solution, which seems to be getting a revival in terms of attention to that as a real possibility. And the basis for this has been around for decades. I mean, the original UN partition plan from 1947 created two states, and with the creation of the State of Israel out of the UN, out of the British Mandate of Palestine. And this has been the basis for every agreement so far. So that is certainly one pathway. Whether it's possible is another question. And then there's various one-state solutions that different groups have advocated. One possibility of the one-state solution is the status quo, which is not a sustainable one-state solution, in which you have a Palestinian population that really doesn't have equal rights. So it is not, you're just going to see repeats of these kinds of dynamics over and over again. And the other one is the one-state solution that you hear some people advocate for, with a civic nationalist single state for Israelis and Palestinians between the river and the sea. And then various other permutations of two-state solutions, like the confederal one that an organization of Israelis and Palestinians called A Land for All has been advocating for a while, and so forth. Whether these are possible is another question. And regardless of what your normative commitments are, I think the real question is not the lack of solutions, but the political configurations that permit any of these solutions to occur. So in my view, the one-state reality that exists right now is not sustainable. And I think we've seen why. And a one-state scenario with equal rights, in my view, is also not realistic at this point in time. Maybe in some future that will occur. Who knows? I can't envision it right now. But we're talking about what's politically feasible. And given the nature of relations between many Israelis and Palestinians, not all, there's still lots of conversations going on, and there are peace groups and dialogues and so forth, but the nature of the state of trauma in both populations, it seems unlikely that you could have an integrated single state without mass violence. So it looks like the two-state solution is the most viable in some abstract sense, but it's how you get there, I think, is incredibly politically difficult. And I think one of the reasons why, apart from the extremely high levels of mistrust between these two populations at the mass level and also at the leadership level, is that you've had decades of negotiations about a two-state solution that have not worked, and part of the reason is that there's been unceasing settlement activity. And so from the Palestinian perspective, there hasn't been much faith in this peace process, including after Oslo, because the commitment was to stop settlement activity, and it has not stopped. And so this is, I think, a really important issue that has reduced trust on the Palestinian side in the peace process itself. So is there political will? What pressure can be brought to bear on Israelis and Palestinian decision makers to compromise? And I think we need to ask what the international order has really done to support a two-state solution. It's impossible to pursue this kind of solution while you have settlement activity continuing and while violence continues. And any kind of long-term solution is going to have to recognize some of the principles from international law. We've had in July a decision by the International Court of Justice that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza is unlawful under international law. And this is based on the prohibition of acquisition of territory by force and also the violation of Palestinian rights to self-determination. And there's other decisions as well. So there are international legal decisions that call for a basis for starting in which Palestinian rights to self-determination are recognized. And so this is also going to be a key consideration for Palestinians as they go into negotiations, because given this ruling that settlements are illegal under the Geneva Convention, this means that if Palestinians concede territory in any negotiations, it would be coming at the expense of rights that have been recognized under international law. So these are really difficult problems that have not been solved through decades of negotiations, but have been increasingly playing out not just on the battlefield, but in international courts. And we've, Ambassador Ross has just talked about the violence and the fact that human rights violations have been committed on both sides. There's no question that October 7th was a severe violation of international humanitarian law. There's also no question that the disproportionate response has involved violations of international law. So this brings me to some questions about how things can go forward. One is, are there real partners for peace negotiations right now? We've heard about the Hamas side, and clearly Hamas has been vested right now in a military approach, although in the past there have been movements toward a negotiated settlement on the part of even Hamas in its 2018 pronouncements. But of course, Hamas is only one of many actors on the Palestinian scene. And again, Hamas in peacetime definitely does not have the support of a majority of Palestinians whatsoever. And there's the Palestinian Authority, which is deeply flawed. It is corrupt. It also has very little jurisdiction. But there are many other Palestinian leaders out there who have the support, who could have the support of the Palestinian people, and so there are potential interlocutors on the Palestinian side. I wonder whether the current Israeli administration is in a position to negotiate. The Netanyahu government does not seem to be interested in engaging in peace negotiations and has been, of course, like prior administrations, this is not the only administration, has supported continued settlement activity. And there seem to be a number of reasons why Netanyahu personally is not interested in engaging in peace negotiations. And certainly elements of his extremist coalition are not interested in peace negotiations and have openly called for annexation of the West Bank. So can we say that there are serious commitments to engage in any kind of negotiations which would move towards a two-state solution or any kind of solution? So that's one question. And I'm also, I want to raise questions about the nature of normalization and how it interacts with the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace. There have been, of course, normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab countries like the Emirates, like Bahrain, Morocco, and so forth. And the discussion was underway with the Saudis, which may very well have been part of the calculation that Hamas undertook to launch the October 7th attacks to try to scuttle that. But will this address the underlying features of the conflict? That's not clear. Many of the Arab states have not been major champions of Palestinian rights historically, and so it's not clear that that engaging in normalization, which may be good for other reasons, will actually get to the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the Saudi demands to include some commitment for Palestinians are rather vague and open-ended, and those kinds of commitments have been there before and have not panned out. So, so these are important questions to ask about how what are the ways forward and how these different tracks of negotiations play into Israeli-Palestinian peace settlements. And in terms of thinking about the day after, it seems like there is going to have to be, there's lots of conversation about what this day after might look like, but there's definitely going to have to be Palestinians themselves involved in self-governance. And this may involve having conversations with actors on the ground who hold power there and have some influence over what's playing out on the ground, whether we like it or not. You cannot impose a solution, otherwise you're just going to get back to the same situation. And unless the root causes of this conflict are resolved, which is that we have two people with claims to this land whose rights need to be recognized, you're really not going to be able to end this, and we'll just be sitting here in another 10 years at another event of this nature. I hope not, but until the root causes are addressed, it's just not going to be possible. So, so the day after is really, I think, it's hard to even imagine, but hopefully there will be a day after soon. And there will have to be some kind of international guarantee there that has the trust of Palestinians and Israelis and involves Palestinians representing themselves and getting to choose who is going to represent them. There's going to be just tremendous amounts of work. I mean, some estimates like 70% of infrastructure in Gaza have been destroyed. You've got tens of thousands of people who have been killed and hundreds of thousands who are traumatized, not to mention Israelis still traumatized, of course, by October 7th. So, so it's going to be a difficult path, but I think the sooner that a ceasefire happens and that this day after can be negotiated, the sooner we can get towards trying to resolve this conflict. Thank you.
Yeah. Would you like to come up? Come on up. First of all, I just want to thank both of you for coming up here, coming across down here to speak to us and bring us a little closer to understanding the complexity of this conflict, which some of us have lived through our entire lives in one form or another. First of all, I just want to ask, would either of you wish to respond to the other? Anything you'd like to just add, subtract, whatever?
I would say generally I agreed with what Melanie had to say. Look, there is, I would just reinforce something she said. I'll say it slightly differently. We are dealing with two populations that are traumatized. When you're suffering from trauma, you know your own pain. You can't relate to anybody else's pain. So the idea that we could bring the two, even if you could identify who's prepared to negotiate, to the same table right now would be, I think, first it wouldn't be very productive, and it's probably not practical. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about negotiations. If there is an end to the war, when I was talking about end the war as a way of getting the hostages released, because the Hamas position has been end the war, we'll release the hostages, they still want prisoners negotiated and so forth, then you'd have to negotiate. But the point is, if you end the war, this notion of Saudi normalization, here I would pick up on something you were getting at. The Saudis are saying, okay, a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. You're right, that's vague. And one would have to begin to give some content to that. And I'm happy to get into a discussion of that. But it seems to me that allows you to begin to talk about the issue of what the future is beyond just what is the day after an internal administration. I agree there has to be a Palestinian involvement in that administration, even though I think it probably needs an international umbrella. If you begin to deal seriously with the Palestinian dimension and you begin to create a combination of vision and benchmarks, you at least now put the issue back on the table, not just at the level of slogans. Where we are right now is when you talk about two states, and I'm a believer that there isn't an alternative to it, precisely for the same reasons you were saying, these are two national movements, both tied to the land, both competing for the same space. Neither is going to give up their national identity. That's just a fact. So you have to have, in my mind, a two-state solution. A one-state outcome is a prescription for an enduring conflict. Neither side is going to disappear. Neither side is going to give up their identity. And in one state, whether the Israeli rights version of the one state, which is, the Palestinians who stay here will accept our terms and those who don't will leave. Let's say the Palestinian version of one state is we have a binational state, which, by the way, binational states in the Middle East don't fare very well. Neither one, from my standpoint, are realistic. Two states may be hard to get to, but it's still the only realistic path. And what I would like to see is use the prospect of normalization, and I'll just add with this one last thought. It's interesting, the one Arab state that Israel has made a kind of a warmer peace with, if it's fair to describe it that way, is the UAE, and they have a lot of trust with the UAE, and the UAE has, as a result, the ability to put some pressure on the Israelis. We always think about US pressure, but those Arab states that have made peace with Israel also have the ability to affect Israeli behavior. You're still going to have to see, in my mind, a different Israeli government. So long as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich can be the arbiters of what's acceptable, nothing is acceptable. I do think Netanyahu, if the choice is a peace with Saudi Arabia that requires him to make hard decisions on the Palestinians that will bring down his government, I still think that has some allure to him, if no other reason than his legacy today is October 7th. I think he would rather have his legacy be normalization with the Saudis.
Thank you. Ellen,
so I'll maybe just a few quick points. I would be really skeptical that the UAE would actually put pressure to defend Palestinian rights. I don't think there's been a long track record of many other Arab states defending Palestinian rights. So there's a real disjuncture between leadership and population, and so the leaderships. It is true that the quote-unquote Arab street has been very pro-Palestinian, but there's been a disjuncture between the actions and pronouncements of leaders and population. So I would be worried about that as a strategy, and also I think from the Palestinian perspective, even though this current government is certainly more extreme than virtually any other, there hasn't been an experience from the Palestinian perspective of a government that's really pushing towards a peace agreement with them. And that is manifest in the continued construction of settlements and so forth. So I think even with a different Israeli government, this is why an approach that would start with a future vision would be met with skepticism by Palestinians, I would imagine. just because they would say, we've been down this road before.
Yeah, no, look, I think it can't just be a vision. When I talk about benchmarks, that means you have to have some things happen on the ground.
Yeah.
You need a top-down and a bottom-up approach. The top can provide a vision, but if you don't have something happening on the ground, no one will believe it because they've seen this movie before.
Great. So with your permission, I'm just going to go right into questions that are coming from this audience. And the first one is, what should be done about the 750,000 or so settlers in the West Bank? How will they figure into any future configuration, two-state solution or whatever? Please.
Want me to start?
Yeah, please,
Okay.
Dennis.
Look, when we came out with the Clinton parameters, of which I was the primary drafter, this was after Camp David, we focused on the concept of settlement blocks and swaps. The idea was the reality of the way Israelis had settled in the West Bank reflected not just ideology, but economic considerations. Mm-hmm. The vast majority, 85% of all the Israelis who live beyond the Green Line, 85% live in 7% of the territory closest to the Green Line, because most of these people they work in Israel. These are like, in their mind, this is suburbs, and so they commute to their jobs. So the idea was you will, the settlements that are outside the block areas, those will disappear. They will have to be dismantled. You will have settlers who will live in the 7%, or we propose 5%, and then you will compensate the Palestinians with territory, and you deal with the settlement issue by, in fact, in a sense, creating a withdrawal, but you have blocks. Now, I will say at Camp David, the Palestinian negotiators suggested that the Israelis could keep the settlements, but they would be under Palestinian law. They would be under Palestinian sovereignty. At that time, the Israeli negotiators didn't favor that because they thought that would be too complicated a system. They said, what happens if there are threats to the Israelis who are living there? You know, the pressure on us to come to their defense will be high. It'll be too great. So they didn't accept it, even though it was a Palestinian proposal at the time. Melanie made a reference to the fact there are those who talk about confederal models right now. Confederal models are based on two states, but with a confederal structure. Those who have been pushing this say you don't have to move populations, and that will make it easier. It does make it easier, but it still doesn't contend with the concern that the Israelis were expressing, which is, okay, what happens if there are threats to the Palestinians who are living in what is the Palestinian state? Who handles that? I think I would have to be more comfortable with how you come up with mechanisms for that. I suspect we have to get to a point where the emotions and attitudes and realities are different than they are today.
Thank you, Reid. You want to add to that?
I was going to mention this confederal system. We actually did an event at the Weatherhead Center last year where we talked about these different scenarios. And this one, I mean, there is a real constituency out there, at least in the peace community, where you have this binational situation, and any Israeli that chooses to stay would be living under a Palestinian state and vice versa. I did want to raise one other point that I neglected to mention earlier, which is to make a two-state solution viable, there would have to be tremendous changes in the way governance of territory plays out right now in the West Bank. First of all, there's severe restrictions of movement for Palestinians. So right now it does feel for Palestinians like they live in little Bantustans and are extremely restricted and cannot move far at all. And there's also, I think, this other issue, which is an additional separate issue of rising settler violence, which has been extremely bad. It's been going on for a very long time. It's getting more media attention now, but now it's getting to be extreme. And there's routine attacks on people's homes, on Palestinian homes, on their crops, on their livelihoods, on their sheep. And there aren't really serious attempts to rein this in. And so I think until things like that are also addressed, it's not going to seem even remotely viable for Palestinians to trust in a system leading to any kind of solution.
Yeah. I mean, there is talk in the confederal model about having councils, shared councils between Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, we're thinking out where issues of water, energy, even security, since they're all about security, might be fashioned in a confederal model. 2 states, but with that. I mean, we're going to move on, so I just thought, oh yeah, please, sure, go ahead, Dennis.
Can I just build on what you said?
Yeah.
And this gets back to the idea when I talk about the ground up. There are very small peace communities on both sides. And in Israel and among Palestinians, there are NGOs like the Arab Institute, Demura on the Palestinian side. They actually talk to each other. They actually work together. And so, one, there needs to be much greater exposure of this because both sides need to see it. Right now, they think it's inconceivable. So they need to see there are Palestinians and Israelis who actually work together, number one. Number two, the point you just raised, it provides a bit of a model for how you begin to build from the ground up. There are functional issues on which cooperation is literally necessary. On health, it's literally necessary. On water, it could be literally necessary. On environment, literally necessary. Focusing on practical forms of cooperation where it's necessary for the well-being of both sides is another place where you begin to build and you show it is not impossible for the 2 sides to cooperate. One of the reasons I say this is things have gone so far. I was saying to some students earlier today, what Oslo represented was an end to the existential conflict because there was mutual denial and mutual rejection. This suddenly made mutual recognition. It made it a political conflict, not an existential conflict. The reality of where we are today is we're back to an existential conflict. And we have to show it's not an existential conflict or we can deal with it. That requires demonstrating so it's visible that Israelis and Palestinians actually can cooperate on things.
Great. So U.S. policy is somewhere up there, I think, on the screen.
It is.
Here is a question. Would the Biden or another administration, and one may be coming shortly, I'm told, would it use U.S. military assistance as a leverage to push for an end to the war? Would cutting off military aid, weapons exports, have a significant impact on Israeli military policy? Would it have any clout? Would it work? Do you want to start? Please, Melanie.
I think that's one of the main sources of leverage out there. I think it's probably the only realistic leverage on the Israeli government is aid. I mean, Israel is getting billions of dollars of aid every year from the United States. I think it might be the largest aid recipient from the United States globally, or certainly one of the largest. And so I think that's the only real source of leverage. I mean, no effort to reprimand and say you behave badly works. So frankly, I think that's the only thing that can be done. Whether it will be done, I think, is another question. This country politically doesn't seem ready for that, although public opinion is definitely shifting around this issue. But I think that's going to have to be out there on the table.
No perceptive change should there with the election, regardless of who gets in? Would there be?
Would the administrations vary on this?
Yes.
I don't think they'll vary radically on their position on this question.
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
I don't.
Good.
Well, I know I agree on the last point you made that I'm not sure there's going to be a big difference, but I don't agree with the. Look, Israel is the only state in the region whose existence is threatened by Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, explicitly, and they don't just limit it to words. Their aim is to have no Israel. So the minute you would stop providing or embargo arms to Israel, the message to the Iranians is going to be, we can really succeed at this. Now, having said that, we cannot be in a position, and I used to say this as a negotiator, where Israel says to us, we're a sovereign state, we get to do, we have to make our decisions, we have to do what we want because we think this is important to us. And I used to say to them, you're quite right. You know who else is a sovereign state? So are we. And if you are pursuing a policy that we think is fundamentally wrong, don't presume that we're gonna not only support it, but that we have no options. We don't have to be supporting things that we completely disagree with. Now, that doesn't mean I would use arms as a lever, because I think there's another lever. We protect Israel at the Security Council. That doesn't have to be automatic. And that has all sorts of implications over time. So, if I think the way I would do it, I think whoever is the next president needs to sit with whomever is the next Israeli prime minister. I'm implying there'll be a next Israeli prime minister. Because I think one thing I will say with categoric certainty, and I will tell you, when it comes to the Middle East, one should start by checking their ego, and the first thing they should emphasize is their humility. Because it's easy to get things wrong on the Middle East. But I would say on this one, an American president should talk to an Israeli prime minister at the very beginning of an administration, quietly just sort of say, look, explain, you have your interests. We oftentimes will be supportive of that because those who threaten you also threaten us. But there will be times when you're doing things that we really fundamentally disagree with. And you cannot expect that if we fundamentally disagree, we just sort of automatically support what you do. So we're going to create some boundaries here, so you understand. There won't be surprises on our side, but we'll let you know these are the kind of things we would be prepared to do. Now, if that kind of a conversation is held privately, it will affect whoever the Israeli prime minister is. Doesn't mean there won't be disagreements. Doesn't mean there may not be times where basically we will publicly disagree, and there'll be some things we need to do about it. But I'm very reluctant to use arms because of the signal it sends to those who don't want Israel to exist and act on that impulse.
Okay. Would you like to? Please.
I would like to say one thing. First of all, we can disagree about that. There's also what arms you use as well. But I'm not. I think you make an excellent point about the UN security veto possibility, which has, this has been one thing of multiple things that has protected Israel globally is American Security Council vetoes. But I'm not convinced that the UN has become such an effective body that it would be able to put a stop to things without other levers as well. The other thing I would say is I totally understand Israeli existential concerns, and I think it is important to address those. But I would also point out that from the perspective of Israel's neighbors, people feel existential risk from Israel's action. So Palestinians feel existentially threatened by Israel, and now periodically Lebanese have as well. So this is a more complex situation, I think, than just one side, one coalition directing threats at the other.
Great. Maybe I could turn back to you, ask for some thoughts on how you see what is going on in South Lebanon now and right up to Beirut, how this may affect the entire Gaza-Israel situation. How could that play out?
Yeah, I would agree with Dennis that I don't think Hezbollah is looking for a fight here. They know it's not going to go well, even if they'll live through it. So I think everything has demonstrated through the last year that they're looking to play this more controlled game, which is now getting jeopardized because it's been ratcheted up tremendously in the last few days. So I think, we're in a really dangerous situation here. It could spiral out of control. It seems that Israel has turned the theater to the north now and is, determined that they can pull back from Gaza a little bit and turn there. But I think it would be very difficult for Hezbollah, from a face-saving perspective, to just stand down entirely, because they present themselves as the resistance and the defenders. So I think they're not going to stop entirely, but maybe there's a way that it can sort of wind down in some kind of face-saving way. They'll make some proclamation about how they resisted or something. That would be the best case scenario at this point, but I think it's a delicate situation because, I mean, now we have over 500 people dead in Lebanon, many civilians. I know a close friend who's lost a number of her nieces and nephews and cousins 2 days ago. And so, you know, civilians that have nothing to do with Hezbollah have been killed. And so I think it's an incredibly dangerous situation right now, and could easily spiral out of control.
And no, look, I'm very worried about it also taking on a life of its own. I think there's an interesting Iranian element here. The most important proxy Iran has is Hezbollah. They might be prepared to sacrifice all the other proxies, but not Hezbollah. I think there could be a kind of multilateral approach here where the Iranians come to understand that if this does end up taking on a life of its own, that Hezbollah, you know, while they can inflict real damage on Israel, Israel can weaken Hezbollah to the point where it becomes very vulnerable to its enemies in Lebanon, and it has lots of enemies in Lebanon. So I think that one could construct a diplomatic approach where you start by saying we're going to create calm, we're going to create a situation where the populations on each side can return to the border. There was something that Amos Hochstein was working on, which is at a certain point you could talk about some border modifications, which would be Hezbollah's explanation for, you know, why they were doing all this. I think pressure from the Iranians, basically on them to say this is, you know, let's look for a way out. I think that could give it a way out. Look, I will admit that my natural instinct, having done what I've done for so long, is to always think, okay, what's the possible diplomatic opening here? What's the potential leverage we have to affect it? I do think the fear potentially of an all-out war is something that ultimately neither side wants. Think about where we are. What I said before about Hezbollah, they haven't hit Tel Aviv. They know if they hit Tel Aviv, we're definitely off to the races. But there's also limits. The Israelis are not hitting everything they could hit either, which means they're signaling in their own way, even though what they're doing is quite significant in terms of the scope of what they're doing. They have dramatically weakened Hezbollah already. You know, it doesn't mean Hezbollah probably still has more than 100,000 rockets they could fire, and probably half of them can cover all of Israel with a lot of payload. So there's a big prohibition on the Israeli side. But the reality is what the Israelis have done over the last several days have probably eroded a major chunk of 20 years of investment of what Hezbollah has been doing.
Great, thank you. Evan, I think we're going to have to bring this to a close, knowing our time.
Yeah, so
thank you.
First, can you please join me in thanking our speakers and Phil for a really excellent discussion. Thank you. And thank you. I'll ask them to remain seated. I'm just going to invite Karl Reid up here for a few last remarks, and then you're all invited to lobby 13 for a reception. Karl.
Well, thank you, Evan, and thank you all for being here and joining. Phil, we recognize and thanked our speakers, but you mastered Slido, so congratulations to you as well. So I'd like to thank Evan Lieberman and the staff at the Center for International Studies for hosting this event and putting together such a great program. So thank you. Can I just have members of the CIS? Thank you so very much. CIS does an amazing job bringing the complexities of world events to MIT. They brought us together to hear from world-leading experts like these about events, conflicts, or movements happening in Ukraine, China, Iraq, Iran, and of course, Israel and Gaza. So thank you. And we've also found the same stylist as well. Lastly, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Middle East and North African MIT Group. Started just last year, as we heard earlier, MENA MIT connects activities and initiatives at MIT related to these regions. The lead coordinators, Richard Nielsen and David Dullov, are doing important and meaningful work at MIT, and they deserve our thanks as well. Thank you. Giving a community, even this one, access to expertise doesn't necessarily ensure that it will diffuse conflict within that community, but it helps. The ICO was founded to foster this community as well, to deliver services and programs and convene people, resources, and systems from around campus to reflect our mission and to shepherd the Institute's values and advance MIT's vision of inclusive excellence. Today's event is an important example of this last point of prioritizing community building and respectful discourse and dialogue. And we heard it was said that really until people recognize each other as human beings, it's impossible to have dialogue. Thank you, Melanie, for that. And so we have to interrupt these cycles of dehumanization as part of this effort to really foster dialogue, respect, and trust. So lastly, before I give it the mic, I've been asked to once again invite you all to gather for a reception in Lobby 13. So if you're not familiar with MIT, everything is numbered. You can send mail to a restroom if you'd like. But Lobby 13, I believe it's down one floor and then this way, back toward this area. So please join us then. Thank you again to our speakers, to CIS for hosting, and to all of you for coming. Good afternoon.